1, 2, 3.
While our weekly shows are edited to time for broadcast on public TV and community radio, we offer to our members and podcast subscribers the full uncut conversation. The following is from our episode, Political Violence and MAGA Militancy, Strategies to Protect Democracy. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters. Become a member at lauraflanders.org/donate.
Violence is bad for democracy. It sounds pretty obvious. The whole idea is based on people participating and making political choices free from bullying, intimidation, or threats, right? Yes, well, according to a recent report from Reuters, that may be the truth, but we are seeing more political violence than we have seen in decades. Some 213 cases just since January 6, 2021, including 39 deaths. Women, people of color, Muslims, Jews, and LGBTQ people are among the most vulnerable. But interestingly, the group that is actually suffering the fastest increase in reported incidents are conservatives, people who are perceived to be out of sync with the authoritarianism, pro-Trump MAGA agenda. This makes political violence a cross-cutting issue. A supermajority of American voters, more than 80%, oppose violence in all contexts, including a majority of Republicans. But those numbers may be falling. So while violence is growing, we have a cross-cutting issue. We still have a chance to get ahead of this scary trend. And it's clear that we must, if any of our other efforts to strengthen democracy and freedom are not going to fall apart. So how do we do that? Well, in tricky conversations like this, I reach out to my friend Scot Nakagawa, who I'm welcoming back to co-host. He is director of the 22nd Century Initiative, and he has worked as an organizer and strategist against authoritarianism and for inclusive democracy since the late 1980s. His efforts have spanned organizations combating racist, anti-Semitic, and fundamentalist groups, as well as advocating for LGBTQ rights. Scot, welcome back to Laura Flanders and Friends. Friend, I'm very glad to have you with me for this important conversation.
Well, I'm glad to be here. It's nice to see you again, friend.
We've got some great people with us.
Joining us for this discussion are Sala Cyril, Interim Executive Director of Vision Change Win, an organization that focuses on community safety, something that's on many people's minds. Sala also organizes with the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement New York chapter, an organization that knows quite a bit about political violence. And we have Maria J. Stephan, who is the chief organizer and co-lead of the Horizons Project. The Horizons Project is focused on strengthening relationships between the social justice, peace building, and democracy communities in the U.S. and globally. She is also the co-author with Erica Chenoweth of Why Civil Resistance Works, the Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. And along with them, we'll also hear from Hardy Merriman, who is the president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. He is the author of the guide, Harnessing Our Power to End Political Violence, or HOPE. And he's speaking to us as in an independent capacity on political violence in the U.S. So very happy to be here. Great to be with you. And let's get into it. So, Maria and Salah, let's start with some stories. Most of us are familiar with the January 6th attack on the Capitol, of course. We hear about that ad nauseum on the news. But there are other stories, like the story of Paul Pelosi, the husband of former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who was attacked by a far-right conspiracy theorist in October 2022. And the mass murder of 10 African-American customers at a Buffalo, New York grocery store on May 14, 2022, that same year. These incidents are obviously incidents of political violence. Motivation has been demonstrated. A political goal was trying to be achieved, but all of it is happening against the backdrop of so much more, including a rapid increase in bias crimes. So can you help us understand what you mean by political violence and why there is a specific distinction there that we should be concerned about? And let's start with Maria.
So, when we're talking about political violence, what do we mean? So political violence includes threats, intimidation, acts of physical violence that is used with a political motivation to achieve a political goal or to assert political power over another group. And we know that in the United States that the preponderance of acts of political violence are being committed by the far right, with a smaller number of incidents being committed by the far left. So as you noted, no one is immune from being targeted, although we know that historically marginalized communities, Black Americans, Brown Americans, LGBTQ, are being disproportionately targeted with political violence in this moment, but also a number of conservatives, including those that aren't towing the MAGA line. So it's harming a lot of people across the country.
And a lot of people who are unaffiliated with either political party as far as anyone is concerned, but who are trying to basically fulfill the duties of jobs that are related to elections, et cetera. People who are considered to be functionaries of government who are also viewed in opposition to the MAGA coalition. Is that right?
Exactly. So election officials, judges, politicians, local school board members, librarians are receiving threats, intimidation, being targeted with violence. So yeah, it's affecting people in all aspects of civic life who are trying to fulfill basic civic duties, who are being, threatened, harmed, intimidated.
And so why is it that you said most of these incidents come from the far right? So why is it that the far right relies so heavily on political violence?
Well, political violence, I like to think of it as the grease in the wheels of authoritarianism. And we know that political violence in the United States is being accompanied with a rise in authoritarianism from the far right. And what do autocrats around the world do? They want to try to make people fearful. They want to use fear-based divide and rule as a means to maintain power and control. So they don't want people challenging their political power. They don't want dissent. They don't want people actively exercising their basic civil and political rights. And so it's kind of has been a tried and true method of autocrats in this country and around the world to get people to remain silent, to be too paralyzed and too terrorized to take action. So that's often the intent of political violence.
It definitely gets one's attention, and it gets the attention of the mass media when you have somebody like Samuel Alito's Supreme Court Justice's wife, Martha Ann, seeming to make threats based on her German heritage about what she will do to people that don't like her flying a shame flag. It gets attention, but coming to you, Sala, it's not like political violence is a brand new occurrence in this country. I mean, go back through the history, and some groups have been subject to it for centuries. I would love to get a sense from you of what you do on a daily basis, work-wise, and what's changed, what hasn't changed in this moment for the people that you work with closely.
Well, thank you. Yes, you're right. Unfortunately, this is not new. And we have been experiencing this level of political violence for decades and centuries, honestly. But one of the things that we do at Vision Change Win is we offer overall organizational development, but very specifically community safety support and community safety and security support to organizations and activists and leaders and people that are fearful of political violence, right? That are concerned about political violence in retribution for the work that they may be doing. So on a regular basis, we are offering rapid response support to groups that have, they may be going to a protest and have heard that there are counter protesters that will arrive with weapons, right? We offer organizational support to groups that need security infrastructure support. Or we also offer support to groups that are trying to build safety teams, right? Just because we believe that creating community safety and security is everyone's responsibility, right? And not only is it everyone's responsibility, and when I say everyone, I mean literally everyone, right? From, janitors to, door folks to, aunties, grandmas, everybody, and which means, and it's because, as you said before, everyone suffers, right? There aren't people that are exempt. And so, and we come from a history and a legacy of organizations like the Young Lords, like the Black Panther Party, that created community safety support and techniques for people to protect themselves, not only for specific state threats, but just as standard community. The right level of violence was high. And then from there, the organizations, a lot of our legacy came out of New York City specific safety and security lineage, groups like the organization that I'm a part of, my political home, the Malcolm X grassroots movement, the Audre Lorde Project, the Coalition Against Police Brutality, CAV, and People's Justice, Sister to Sister, the Justice Committee, right? There are a legacy of New York City organizations that worked to not only specifically continue the work of the Young Lords and the Black Panther Party, but to expand it, right? So Vision Change Win, we focus on Black and Brown folks, the queer and trans communities, disabled folks, to ensure that we see ourselves, in the work that we do.
And CAV being the campaign, I think, or Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence. The groups that you've mentioned, and we'll come back to you in a second, Maria, but the groups that you've mentioned and the history that you've described, Sala, speaks to a desire to keep certain people intimidated, perhaps, and out of our process. In the worst case scenario, it works, right? I mean, what we're talking about is a fear that people will be intimidated out of participating in the process. Is that what you've seen?
Oh, definitely. Well, so a little bit of history, I won't be long, but my mother was a member of the Black Panther Party. She was one of the co-founders of the Free Breakfast Program, right? And that was declared one of the highest threats to national security. Now, the state thought that, but the people, the kinds of threats that regular people trying to get their children fed faced were high, right? The kinds of threats that we see regular, everyday people face, Black of those communities that we're supporting, have been so high. And we're seeing things like people being killed. We're seeing things like people being chased. The kinds of work that the Malcolm X grassroots movement does is to support groups that and people that have been identified as victims of police brutality. Now, very specifically, those people that are identified as victims of police brutality, the families are being attacked by not only the state, but also, the right? And so there on a regular basis, there are people being attacked.
We had a chance to talk with researcher Hardy Merriman. He is president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict and has been looking into this subject for a newly released report. He was speaking to us in an independent capacity about this reporting, and I started by asking him what he was seeing in terms of the frequency of political violence.
So when we take those two, a broad definition of violence and a narrow definition of political, what we see in the U.S. is that for a country of 330 million people, there's actually a fairly low incidence of physical political violence. There aren't a lot of people who are actually being physically injured because of their expressed political viewpoints at this moment. But the dynamic of threats and intimidation is obviously skyrocketing. So that's a real concern. And it relates to physical political violence too, because even if you have a few cases of physical political violence, it causes threats to seem credible. So the dynamic of threats is a major concern and is something we have to do something about. The way I look at it, there's actually three groups that are part of this sort of ecosystem of what generates threats. And the first group are inciters. And inciters are people who are trying to build a following. They're trying to they're sort of entrepreneurial about it, trying to get political power, create a following, sometimes monetize that following. So we tend to know who inciters are. And they engage in a sort of toxic rhetoric where they talk about their viewers as virtuous, good, upholding the highest values, and so forth. And they define another group as a fundamental threat, where that group shares collective blame for all kinds of problems. And they heat up the rhetoric to the point that violence starts to seem permissible against this perceived threat group. And that if the democratic process actually delivers an election victory to that other group, then inciters normalize the idea that perhaps democracy itself is not adequate and should be undermined. Then the next group are what I call threat makers. This group tends to be male, tends to be, according to one study by CNN, average age of about 37 years, tends to have a generally higher formal education and income level than your standard sort of general criminal population, though I would point out that because of First Amendment protections, many threats are actually not criminal in this country. And based on the data that I can read, it does seem that threat makers tend to lean more to the right wing. However, there are certainly threat makers who are on the left wing as well. And then the last group are actually enactors, people who are going to do physical violence. And interestingly enough, a lot of threat makers don't go on to enact political violence, and a lot of enactors don't necessarily make threats ahead of time. For example, the man who attacked Nancy Pelosi's husband, my understanding is he did not make threats ahead of time. The individual who shot the congressional baseball game and wounded Congressman Scalise and others, my understanding is he did not make threats ahead of time. So there are these three different groups, and sometimes they overlap, but actually I think it's helpful to think of them distinctly. But the good news is that there are a lot more of us than there are of them. And so if political violence and threats are used to try to achieve political goals, it's up to us to counter those political goals. We can make them, by organizing, less politically profitable for the people who do that.
Well, that was Hardy Merriman of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. I wanted to now, though, ask the question of Maria. Maria, what Sala said about this long history of violence that certain communities have faced is reflected in the current wave of violence, right? Certain groups are much more targeted than others. And I wonder if you can tell me why you think that is. Why specifically are far-right groups going after these very vulnerable communities that have already suffered from such long histories of exclusion and violence?
Sure. Well, I think, Sala helpfully, described the long history of political violence. And there's also a long history of authoritarianism in the United States. And, one thing we know from our history is that anytime there have been attempts to advance multiracial democracy in this country, those attempts have been met with fierce backlash. They've been met with violent authoritarian backlash. And so that's been the trend, whether it was the response to Reconstruction, the response to the Civil Rights Movement, to the movement for Black Lives, attempts to advance racial justice and, a democracy for everyone, where everyone enjoys equal rights under the law, has been met by those who have a particular vision of the kind of country that they want to live in, a white-dominated Christian national country. And so attempts to challenge that particular vision of the country and that particular power structure. So those who have been challenging it, and that's the history of movements in this country, right? Like every advance of rights, freedoms, and democracy have come as the result of social movements: abolition, women's suffrage, economic, social justice, environmental rights, civil rights, LGBTQ equality. So everyone who's pushing for that, multiracial, pluralistic, inclusive democracy where everyone has voice and can be represented, that is met with backlash. And so I think we're seeing the current manifestation of that long chapter of people who are vying for basic rights, freedoms, who have been advancing a more just and equal society, being met with backlash. The other kind of, phenomenon that we have going on in this country is that one of our two political parties now has been captured by an authoritarian faction. So that is like, this is the development today. The MAGA faction, which, often endorses various forms of hate-fueled violence, political violence, is in control of the Republican Party. And it's not just Donald Trump. Donald Trump is one figure within a party and within an authoritarian apparatus that is enabling the kinds of violence and attacks on and scapegoating that we have observed over the course of history. So that is the current state of play right now in the U.S.
I have one question for you on that, Maria, in that some of the targets, the primary targets seeing an increased incidence, we said at the top, according to that Reuters reporting, are people actually on the conservative flank.
Yes.
I'm wondering how reliable the numbers might be, because I wouldn't think they were that used to actually recognizing, reporting on political violence. And if they were, they might not know where to turn. So I would just love your thoughts, both Sala and Maria, on that particular aspect that you've drawn our attention to. Maybe start with you, Maria, and then come to Sala.
Sure. Well, I can't speak exactly to the data sources and, who is collecting the data. However, I can report anecdotally through different interactions with conservatives that they are experiencing political violence. So I've been in attendance with secretaries of state, former lieutenant governors. They all have stories of themselves or their families being on the receiving end of political violence. And I've also heard about conservative librarians who, because they refuse to pull books out of the shelves, they refuse to go along with the book banning movement, they are being targeted with threats, intimidation. And so I don't doubt, actually, that there is a rise in the number of incidents of people from across the political and ideological spectrum who are being targeted with these threats, because it has become mainstreamed, and on a particular part of the political spectrum in this country, it has been endorsed or enabled actively. And that's the difference between political violence that occurs on the left in the US, because there are incidents of political violence. However, it does not receive the endorsement of the political mainstream, the Democratic Party. That is quite different from the situation of political violence emerging from the far right.
I will add that the groups and people and individuals that have been emboldened by the recent history of something like January 6th, something like, and the ways that it's been responded to, not only in the actual, within the state, but then the way that communities and groups of people have risen up to say, yes, that's right, I see myself there, to be able to respond to then authoritarian, kind of a rule book, to continue to harass and address people that just don't follow up with the kind of things that they want. And like Maria said, when you're talking about librarians, when you're talking about school districts, when you think about teachers and the ability to teach without fear, right? That's not happening. If people are being directly threatened, and not just empty threats, real violence is happening. So,
is bullying a good frame for this, do you think, Scott?
Bullying is a pretty good frame. What do you guys think? I think it's a good frame.
I think so.
I just want to make sure that we're in sync here. Yeah.
I mean, most people are against bullying, right? Why don't we just call this bullying?
Yeah. That's right.
And sometimes bullying tips over into actual physical violence, and sometimes it can be lethal violence. And so, so that's so there's a terrorizing aspect of it, of course, and it's intended to influence people's decision making, like what they do they decide to run for office or no? Do they take a stand on a particular issue or not, knowing that if they do take a stand, they will face threats or worse? Do they vote for impeachment for a former president, or do they not vote for impeachment because they fear their families are going to be targeted? So all these are live stories that are happening in society, and it's affecting every kind of aspect of democratic participation, which is why even if the overall number of physical acts of violence may seem small, it is having disproportionate effects on all aspects of civic and democratic participation in this country.
While the commercial media is centered on what sells advertising, which is too often fear, we're centered on change makers, imagining a better world and creating the solutions to get us there. That's thanks to the generous support of viewers and listeners like you. While we are independent media, we do depend on you. Please contribute by making a one-time donation or make it monthly at lauraflanders.org/donate. As Angela Davis says, when vast numbers of people come together, this is how change happens. Please come together with us now. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your continued support.
So I'm listening to you. What I'm hearing is that, political violence is growing, that it's a real threat to democracy. And you've explained why. In the, kind of way I understand this, basically, the United States is a liberal democracy, right? It's not just a democracy. We don't just vote in elections, the majority always rules, right? We actually have these liberal institutions that are dedicated to protecting minorities and individual rights. But historically, those institutions have failed us again and again when those minorities and individuals have been among those that are excluded from the, from political life, right? African Americans, other people of color, new immigrants, women, many other groups, LGBTQ people, etc. And in that space of exclusion, there's like a muscle almost that has been developed among conservative and far-right factions in the United States to take advantage of that space and use direct intimidation, bullying, and violence in order to be able to exclude people from being able to change those circumstances and be able to start to affect political outcomes. And that's what we're really looking at here, right? It's a legacy of all of that in this moment. And so, given that, it just seems to me to be a real, very important sort of call to action to do something, right? And particularly on the part of those who have been most victimized, who I think, are often shunted to the corner as if they're simply victims, when in fact they have really important stories to tell that could help us understand what's happening around us, what it looks like, and how it feels and how it's impacting people on a day-to-day basis. So how do we go about doing that? What are some of the tools that you're developing, some of the approaches you're developing to help ordinary people who are being visited by violence or know people who are being visited by violence or harassment, for them to take action, to do something?
Sala?
Yeah. Well, thank you, because that is so true. People have been experiencing this level of violence, and therefore, because of that level of violence and who they are, have been, I would say, kind of an organized abandonment. This phrase that's often used just for gentrification, but I think also applies to the people. And, the kinds of things that we teach and support and help train are about basic de-escalation techniques, right? And to ensure that as things continue to escalate, as things continue to just become a problem, that they're able to address them, right? Also, some basic safety planning. What do you do if someone is threatening you? What kind of exit plan do you have? What kind of safety plan do you have? And that includes things like, building basic things like emergency contacts and making sure you share that with someone. But then also digital security support. A lot of the threats happen digitally, and not just doxing, but hacking and swatting and the kinds of things that put people in real physical danger.
Just
right?
to remind people, swatting is where you literally call the cops in on somebody's house, and those police could arrive with guns drawn, on the pretext that there's something happening in that house that the police need to come to.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Thank you for clarifying. Yes. And then other ways like conflict support. And that sounds like, a lot of times organizations, the groups that are doing this really deep work to protect themselves, to protect their rights, that are having difficulty, they need kind of organizational capacity support to ensure that they don't crumble in the face of the kinds of threats that come from the right, the physical threats, and may be intangible, right? And in overall, really shifting the paradigm that security and safety is this white, masculine, patriarchal thing that only, it's only available to this particular look, this particular way. You imagine this, this person that is, huge and will stand in the way, but also really just creating security consciousness, a way to think about moving through the world and creating networks, right, that build resiliency and allow people to lean on each other for the kind of support that is needed. Things like tracking trends of threats and actual violence, right? Being able to ensure that people are just in community and relationship in case they don't have enough people to support a threat that has come.
Love to know what you've heard and whether what you've seen and learned there is applicable here.
Yeah, I mean, well, just a reflection on why today do we have so much political violence, threats of political violence. Well, it's easy to make threats. It's easy to intimidate people, and it's easy to get away with it. So the idea here is, how do you raise the costs, the political costs, the financial costs, the social costs, the economic costs, to make political violence backfire, which Hardy Merriman described earlier. And so a lot of this is, how do we go from the necessity of protecting communities and making ourselves safe and our communities safe, to then going on offense against the perpetrators. So organizing and mobilizing in a way that they pay a price for using political violence and threatening political violence. And this is where, a lot can be drawn. We have a history of it, because political violence has been so integral to authoritarianism in this country. And Salah talked about the civil rights movement. Well, one way that the organizers of the civil rights movement made political violence backfire, they protected their communities and they actively dismantled racial apartheid. They actively dismantled segregation, which was backed by violence, state violence, paramilitary violence, and they did it through strategic collective action. They did it through lunch counter sit-ins. They did it through freedom rides. They did it through boycotts, strikes. They went on offense and they systematically stripped away the social, economic, political power of those who were upholding apartheid in this country. Similarly, around the world, we know the successful campaigns against authoritarianism, whether it was the movement in Chile that ousted violent dictator Augusto Pinochet, whether it was the Polish Solidarity movement that challenged violent communist tyranny, whether it was the Serbian Otpor movement that unseated Slobodan Milosevic, whether it was more recently popular campaigns in Guatemala, in the Gambia, more recently in Poland, a mass mobilization unseated the Law and Justice Party. How they did it is they built a mass, diverse movement of people who were from different parts of society. They were workers, they were professionals, they were students, they were women, they were faith leaders, they were business leaders. They brought them together, they organized them, and they organized strategic campaigns to go after those entities that were propping up authoritarianism in their countries. And this is where we talk about strategic nonviolent action, civil resistance, which is a method of struggle where you're systematically trying to pull pillars of support away from an authoritarian system. So these are the ways that people around the world have been able to organize, mobilize, and fight back.
So let's get down to details, though. So what specific guidance can we offer people who are supporting someone who has been threatened or attacked, or who have been threatened or attacked themselves? Sla?
Yeah, I think that the specific guidance that we can offer is to, if you're being threatened, you should let people know, right? Do not stay in a silo. Make sure that you are connecting with other people or organizations that can offer support. And that may look like different things. If it's digital, if it's physical, you can reach out to people like us at Vision Change Win. And also, if people are actually being threatened with physical violence, if they experience physical violence, and if they experience political violence, it is important to maintain, I said it already, it's important to maintain connection, right? It's important to build community. It is important to connect to organizations or groups that can support what may be happening in your community, in your area. I say organize.
But that's a lot of work for we the people. Isn't there a role for government in all this? Isn't this why we have government? I mean, Maria, coming to you, what demands can we make of government to step in here?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the condemnation of political violence should be coming from every part of the government and every part of our political system in this country. Certainly from the current administration and efforts to condemn violence in all of its forms. And there are certainly legal and litigation strategies that can be deployed, particularly against far-right groups. But it's more like setting the enabling conditions in communities, like our communities being supported with the resources to be able to maintain resilience, to be able to do the kind of organizing that Sala is talking about. So is that kind of support being provided? Are people being challenged within their parties when they are actively endorsing white supremacist groups, or they're actively supporting violence targeting particular groups in society? Is there that condemnation? So I think there can be, things certainly that the government can do from a policy perspective. There are laws that can be used to challenge violent behaviors, threats, intimidation, but you can't rely on government or institutional channels. So that's the thing. There are things governments can do, but some state governments in this country are in the hands of anti-democratic forces right now. They're in the hands of MAGA folks. And so if you're hoping to use those regular advocacy channels or, litigation channels, it may not be effective. And that's why we need communities. We need community mobilization. We need community action. Like Sala's whole focus, we make us safe. We make us safe through defense, and we make us safe by going on offense. And so that's what we're talking about. And communities across this country are doing it. They are going after folks that are targeting gay pride parades through various organizations with religious leaders and veterans groups and businesses who have been involved in kind of anti-white supremacist campaigns. You have in Enid, Oklahoma, one of their city council members was Judd Blevins, who was found to be marching with the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville in 2017. The community mobilized. They got a recall election. They ousted him. Another Republican, a woman, an educator who wanted to restore the town's reputation, stood up, fought back. You have people who are using humor. You have people who are using clowns, who are using life, who are using humanity to resist the forces of political violence and white supremacy. And that's how we win. We organize, we plan, we prepare, and we use methods that they're not prepared for, and that will disarm them. And that's the greatest strength, I think, of the movements across this country.
I love the use of humor here. Because I think that can be a powerful weapon. And I have to say, Salah, that while Laura said most of us don't have the time to do all the things you listed, and I do agree. I think that, isolation is both what makes us vulnerable and apparently what makes people more prone to getting recruited into violent groups, right? So as we build those social networks, we basically deal with the kind of long-term needs, the community in which people can see each other and recognize each other as human beings, and where consequences for acting out against one another are immediate and apparent to all of us. And the reward for not doing so, of course, is also really palpable, real, and material to us. And so those are really great guides, but I'm still stuck with this problem of the cops, right? They seem to be the elephant in the room. When I talked about the failure of our liberal institutions, there is a similar, you could just track it right all the way up the line, failure of law enforcement in addressing violent threats coming to us from the far right, from the Ku Klux Klan all the way up to today. Failures of the police to arrest people for obvious crimes, to effectively conduct investigations into criminal enterprises, and then failures of our court to actually, prosecute people who have obviously committed crimes over often small technicalities. It just feels to me like and yet, at the same time, what we know is that law enforcement attempts to address potential threats in communities that have traditionally been excluded have tended to be very heavy-handed, immediate, and quite effective. So what do we do about this?
And not to mention, I just have to point out, we also have so many stories of fomenting political violence from inside prisons. So,
yes,
just simply locking people up isn't a solution.
Yes, the largest, white supremacist gang in the United States is basically based in prisons, right? And so, these are obviously not solutions, right? Prosecution is no kind of solution, but we do need police accountability. And so how do we go about doing that?
Well, there are so many different ways, but really, ultimately, it is up to the community to hold police responsible. That means that's from techniques like Cop Watch, which is a technique that we use within the Malcolm X grassroots movement. That's documenting police terror in communities, not only documenting it, but then reaching out to the people and making sure that they actually know their rights, right? So know your rights trainings and just really informing the community what is available. I think also creating the alternatives that should exist. Right. So ensuring that, when there are mental health challenges that come up, that it's not just police, that shouldn't be police that respond. So ensuring that community is able to support the changes that are needed to keep their own community safe from specifically police terror.
Salah, coming back to you again for a second on this, because I'm very struck by your story. You started by saying this is personal for you because your mother was herself targeted. And yet the reaction of you and your sister has been to become very visible, very leading activists in exactly this area. So yeah, I would love to hear from you. What turned it into inspiration for you and stimulus for you to get involved, as opposed to get your head down, get out of this, and go and find somewhere out of view to be?
I mean, I honestly, as a child of a Panther, I saw inspiration in every action. Even when I saw, my mother's friends being jailed for long periods of time, or even killed by, police terror, the kinds of stories that came out of their work, the kinds of inspiration, the kinds of movement and changes that they were able to make in the small period of time that they were in action was so inspiring. Not just that, but a lot of those folks, because it's my family, right? I was raised in with the Panther Party as my family. A lot of those folks went on to continue fighting against terror of the state and, building community. And I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to be part of building community and changing the error that we see.
So that goes back to storytelling, it seems to me. We can get inspired by the stories that are inspiring as opposed to the stories that just constantly terrify us to death. That's where the media come in. Maria, you have written extensively covering inspiring stories of civil disobedience in the face of life-threatening violence in this country and internationally. Share some of that, will you? And what's its relevance for today? Because sometimes those stories of civil disobedience are kind of cast in a retro haze, as if it's from a previous generation, not this one.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, the whole history of the U.S., it has been a long history of authoritarianism and a whole longer history of fighting back against authoritarianism. And so that is the history of our movements in this country that have brought people together across difference, have used, active, direct action tactics to be able to, target bad legislation, to be able to target systems of oppression, whether the police, whether it's corporations. That's the history of movement organizing, and that's the history of nonviolent resistance in this country. And, when I'm referring to civil resistance or nonviolent resistance, I'm talking about a method of struggle that involves the application of force without violence. So I'm talking about the use of direct action tactics, boycotts, strikes, civil disobedience, non-cooperation, protests, vigils, the whole gamut that's used to apply pressure on the opponent, economic pressure, political, social, financial, and raise the price, raise the cost and the price of repression and authoritarianism without the threat or the use of violence. And the reason why nonviolent resistance in this country and around the world, and yes, I've spent a good chunk of the past quarter century working with and writing about movements around the world that have challenged various forms of authoritarianism. And these have been activists and movements that have challenged left-wing autocrats. These have been movements that have challenged fascist right-wing autocrats. And part of that is trying to understand, well, when and why are they successful? What makes for successful pro-democracy movements? And so what we've learned, and this is some of the research that I've conducted with Erica Chenoweth and others, and there's been tremendous scholarship on kind of civil resistance and when it's been effective against authoritarianism and authoritarian regimes, is kind of what we know about this is that movements succeed when they attract mass diverse participation. So you really do need people from different parts of society, different sectors. You need people who are ideologically different, who are politically different, who are laborers, who are professionals, who are young people. So the more they are involved in a campaign, the more representation that movement has and the more power it has. So we know that mass diverse participation is really important in challenging violent authoritarianism, or in this country, racial authoritarianism. We know that movements that are able to tap into a diverse array of tactics, so they don't just keep doing the same thing. They don't just go out into the street and demonstrate or march. They do tactics like walkouts. They do pressure tactics like consumer boycotts, or other acts of non-cooperation, strikes, which have been one of the most powerful general strikes, whether it was in Chile, whether it was in South Africa. Other countries have been the most powerful tactics to push back against authoritarianism. So they use mass diverse participation. They innovate tactically. And importantly, they separate violent autocrats from their pillars of support. So because autocrats need bureaucrats, they need business people, they need workers, they need faith leaders to give them moral authority. So what successful nonviolent resistance movements do is they systematically pull those pillars away from an autocrat so that they're like emperors with no clothes. They no longer have their moral and material support because movements that have used both dialogue and persuasion, the usual coalition building stuff, but also pressure. Like they've actually targeted pillars that are enabling violent authoritarianism with strikes, boycotts, pressure. They did it certainly in the Philippines during the People Power campaign there. They've done it in Poland. They've done it in Serbia, in Ukraine, in Georgia, in the Zambia, in Gambia. So this is a global methodology for challenging repression and authoritarianism. And it doesn't always work. Not all nonviolent resistance campaigns have succeeded. They certainly have not. However, they have a stronger track record than we're sometimes led to believe.
So, Scott, coming to you, I'd love to hear a closing question from you, but I am hearing something very strongly. I think there's been a tendency, including on my own part, to sort of downplay how nervous this political violence makes us, because we somehow believe, or I've somehow thought, the more we talk about it, the more it becomes real, the more people don't want to participate. What I'm hearing is the opposite, that we need to call it out, we need to talk about it more, we need to demand action from some responsible parties, and then we need to get super creative. Now, it has to be said, I'm not seeing a mass boycott of the Republican Party right now, or the Republican convention. But then again, the Republican Party or the Republican leadership, then again, the Republican National Convention is coming up in Milwaukee. Is that a target for the kind of action you're talking about? And if not that, then where might be some sort of strategic pressure points, Scott, in your view?
Well, those are all really strategic pressure points. I think the most important thing to keep in mind, though, is that a supermajority of Americans are opposed to political violence, right? And to violence in general, to the use of force in political decision making. And that's a kind of bipartisan majority, right? And so, I think that simply addressing the experience that people have, this growing anxiety over whether or not you will be targeted because of what do you say, what you do, what you wear, or who you associate with, holds a huge amount of potential. Maria referenced the People Power movement in the Philippines. It's one of my favorite examples. And the thing that I remember about it most is that the movement organized a run on the state bank that forced the autocrat out of power by recognizing that, of course, the autocrat's power was derived by control of the banking system, right? And, I lived in Hawaii at the time. Ferdinand Marcos was chased to Hawaii, and then he became our problem. But I was certainly glad to see him leave the Philippines. And so, I think that these things are really important. But, Maria, when you were talking about civil resistance, I think, one of the things that I remember you saying once, that it only takes about 3.5% of people to engage in a sustained mass mobilization to basically affect regime change,
Wow.
right? And so give us some hope. What does that look like?
I mean, let's just say 3.5% of any population is a large number of people. So you don't want to underestimate. So yes, and this is, my colleague, Erica Chenoweth, who's a professor of government at Harvard University, crunched the numbers as part of our research from Why Civil Resistance Works. And Erica, they found that no regime has remained in power when 3.5% of the population has engaged in active protest. So active protest. And so, yes, and that has been kind of the tipping point. And and it's very hard to reach 3.5%. Of course, I'm trying to think. I think the Women's March, for example, in 2017 got somewhere close to 2%, maybe, or just over 2%. However, the movement for Black Lives, so after, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd were murdered in the summer of 2020, you had the largest and most sustained protests and demonstrations in U.S. history. And I don't know what percentage of the population was engaged, but researchers, including Erica and others, were able to say this was the largest sustained, and by breadth. So the number of towns, cities, locations in the United States that were involved in some form of active protest demonstration was huge. It was unprecedented. And this didn't happen magically, right? It was the result of years of organizing by the Movement for Black Lives and the coalition that came together. So there were like so many people participating in different ways. And, has it ended racial injustice in this country? Absolutely not. However, it was a massive moment of reckoning in this country. It has led to different types of organization, different pressure points on police departments, and other kind of entities that were enabling white supremacy, racism in this country. But that was enabled through organization. And that's another key lesson, I think, with all this. Like, you get to 3.5% by organizing and by investing in institutions that allow you to maintain resilience when the violence comes, because the violence will come. It always comes to those who challenge political power. Like, that's like a fact of movements, if you will, or a law of movements. You challenge political power, you will be faced with violence and repression. However, the ability to withstand it and the ability to make it backfire. So, and that's going back to this concept of backfire. How do we make the violence that is meted out on our people, on our communities, how do we make it backfire so that the perpetrators lose support, pay a price, and our movements gain support? That's backfire. And you need organization for that. You need...
Well, we have a large, widely distributed national event coming up in the next few months, namely our elections.
Yes.
Seems like we have many opportunities to organize in the way that you've described it. I would love to ask each of you our classic closing question on this program, which is, what do you think is the story the future will tell of this moment? I would love to imagine that we see local organizing in defense of election workers, just for starters, maybe, show up in mass at the polls in visible nonviolent ways. And every time there's violence raised by a politician, used by a politician, or that they don't speak out. But Sala, what would you like to see be the story the future tells of this moment?
I would love for the story that the future tells of this moment to be that when people came out to challenge what is happening in this country via elections and all the other ways, that they are met with hope, that they are met with the change that is needed, and that they are not met with the political violence that has been rained down upon them. And that if it does come, that they have organized together enough through backfire tactics to protect themselves.
Yeah, I hope that history reflects that we met the moment, that we recognized what was happening in this country. We were able to see that and connect the dots of the political violence, of the scapegoating of communities, of the attempt to overthrow elections, of like all the things, the politicization of institutions, the targeting of journalists and others. We were able to connect the dots in this moment and understand that it was part of a system of authoritarianism, and we were able to organize appropriately. And we were able to draw on the vast repertoire of tactics at our disposal that we have used throughout our history in this country and around the world to effectively fight back against authoritarianism. And we brought more people, different people, into the movement. We brought more white people into the movement for racial justice, because that's how you're going to actually start to dismantle white supremacy and kind of police brutality. We were able to bring people who have never been involved in movements for democracy into the movement in the moment, and we were able to win.
Well, I think what the future will say about this moment is that it's a turning point, right? We are now addressing a public here in the United States for whom violence has not been a big topic when it comes to politics, right? But we are learning quickly that violence is a feature, not a bug, in American political history, and that violence has greatly limited our ability to function as an inclusive, robust, multiracial democracy. That in fact we must deal with it in order to be able to achieve that end. But, I also am just reminded in this moment of something a friend of mine, a friend of yours as well, Laura, told me during the mobilization for Black Lives, right? She's a journalist. She was on the front lines reporting, and then she started texting me and said to me that she was watching while these groups of young people were gathered together and marching and chanting, "We are the children, the mighty, mighty children, fighting for our future, fighting for justice." And she said, the thing is that these young people are not all Black. They're not all people of color. In fact, the majority of them appear to be white. And so she said, I wonder what they mean when they say fighting for the future, fighting for justice. Do they not perhaps feel as if, under the circumstances of the time, the rise of an authoritarian faction in our politics, the pandemic, that their futures are being canceled, and that this opportunity to mobilize is an opportunity to say all of that, not just let's end police brutality, but let's reclaim the future. I think that energy is building and that we can build upon it, but we need to be optimistic. We need to believe we can win. And we need to be able to think about who it is that we need on our side in the broadest terms possible. And I think these efforts to try to end political violence are among them. And by the way, when you said 3.5%, that's what it takes. I have done my research. According to a number of different, like credible research sites, the range, and this includes, the Pew Charitable Center, the Pew Research Center, the range in terms of estimates of how many people in the U.S. public participated in the mobilization during the pandemic goes from 6% to 10%.
Hey.
Right. Now, they don't define participation very well, but that's still something to build upon, right? And we have the movement for Black Lives and all of the years and years and decades of struggle before that to thank for that, and to use as a guide for how we can continue to build on that number and create the support needed, the infrastructure, the people to sustain it for long enough for it to finally be able to achieve the kind of ends that we need to achieve.
Beautiful. Thank you all. Maria Stephan, Sala Cyril, Scot Nakagawa. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for co-hosting this conversation.
Thank you very much, Laura and Scott.
Thank you so much, Laura and Scott. Appreciate this.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this full uncut conversation from our Meet the BIPOC Press monthly series. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters. Please join our members now by making a one-time donation at lauraflanders.org/donate. Or make it monthly. Go to patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. That's also where you'll find more information on this conversation in the episode notes posted. That's patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. And thanks again to all our member supporters.